Das ist der Lehrplan für Horrorfilme. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I butchered that one. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below, and it's going to give you a pretty good overview of what we're doing here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. In short, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. We've done about 100 of them, and then we actually stepped it up and did the Horror Movie Supplement, which was an additional 100 subgenres to the original 100 subgenres that we talked about on the Horror Movie Syllabus. So a different 100 subgenres, stuff that is maybe a little bit more niche or a little bit more interesting to me, or a little bit more whatever, a little bit deeper cut, just stuff that we didn't catch the first time around, and just an excuse really to keep talking to you guys about horror movies as we had finished the Horror Movie Syllabus. And I used it as an opportunity, I'll be honest with you, to explore areas of horror that I wasn't an expert in or didn't really know as much about, or really kind of wanted to just get a little bit more into or a little bit more involved with. And that's what we're talking about today, because we're talking about German horror films. And I don't know a ton about German horror films. That's why I put it on the supplement, so that I would learn a little bit about it, kind of dig into the subgenre a little bit, and kind of get a little bit more exposed to these things. Like, I know the broad strokes of German horror because it's actually pretty important. If you go back 100 years, when you've got the German expressionism of the 1920s, with things like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and of course Nosferatu, which we've talked about a little bit on the channel, and maybe we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the future. But the German expressionism movement is a very pivotal, key beginning of horror movies forever, right? It is highly influential, and it permeates to this day the horror genre as a whole. But then watching the evolution of German horror, going from that expressionism to a little bit more like thriller oriented stuff, crime drama type horror, horror thriller type stuff, then getting into a little bit more like transgressive type horror, things a little more underground, things like angst, which we did cover on the channel, things like that are a little bit more darker, a little bit more hard edged, a little bit more violent, a little bit more like they said, transgressive, then to getting a little bit more of the modern visuals, the aesthetics that are a little bit more modernized, a little bit more accessible, co-productions with other companies, things like Cuckoo that came out recently, which is German, and also I forget what the other country was, but you'll get a little bit more of a mainstream feel to some of the movies. All of this is an evolution of German horror. But what's interesting about it is, if you look at it, it kind of seems like it stacks on itself. Like the expressionism of the 1920s permeates a lot of the movies that we're going to talk about in this video today still. The thriller aspect of it does pop up over and over again. The crime aspect of it, serial killers, things like that. That tends to be a theme that pops up a lot in German horror. The transgressive stuff, a lot of the hard violence, hard disturbing stuff that permeates a lot of the German horror movies to this day. So it's really interesting to see this evolution, or this expanding or building upon the German horror experience throughout the years to what we have now, which is really just like a big smorgasbord, if you will, of variety that is kind of all the same, or not really the same, but thematically, stylistically similar, and yet different influences or different aspects of what we're talking about here in the history of German horror. This is not an expansive thing, obviously. I'm taking 3 movies and using them as representative examples. By the way, using movies we haven't already talked about before on the channel. So, movies after 1970, because that's what we do. And also movies that, haven't, like Angst. I did talk about Angst previously. There's other German horror movies that I've already talked about on the channel. Mark of the Devil came to mind because I was going to use it for this video after I saw it, but then I realized I had already used it. So it's movies we're not going to repeat, of course, but there's plenty to still talk about. Some really great stuff, some of it pretty hard, some of it really artistic, lots of interesting things to talk about. So we're going to go ahead and just dig right into it. But I am going to go ahead and organize them undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, like I do. And in this case, they're going to go in order of how well made they are, like how much I think the filmmaking progressively gets better. Not to say that the first one isn't good, because it is, but they get progressively more interesting visually as we go on. So with that, let's go ahead and snap to attention for these German horror movies. The first German horror movie I want to talk about today, the undergraduate level selection, is Schramm. Schramm came out in 1993 and was directed by Jörg Buttgereit. And I'm probably butchering that name. I'm going to do a lot of butchering of German, I think, today, unfortunately. But Jörg is kind of a notorious or controversial director in Germany. He's well known for being a little controversial. He directed the movie Necromantic, which we did cover on the channel. So if you're familiar with Necromantic, you get an idea of why Jörg might be a little controversial. And Schramm is another one that honestly is a little bit of a controversial movie. It's got a bit of a reputation. And if that reputation is earned, we're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is a little bit of a surreal movie about a serial killer known as the Lipstick Killer, and he's dying and his life is flashing before his eyes, and we're made privy to all of these horrible things, these murders and things that he's done throughout the years or whatever that he's been active, and kind of being shown these almost dreamlike, surreal images of violence and horror. And I'm just going to stop there to not spoil the movie for you, even though the plot is rather thin, if we're being honest with you. This movie is very artsy, kind of student film looking. It's very surreal looking. It's almost like ethereal and very dreamlike. The imagery in this is pretty out there in a good way. It's really well shot. It's a really, I won't go so far as to call it a pretty film, but it's a visually arresting film. It's a very interesting aesthetically to look at, and it's a cheap movie. It's a low budget movie, and it's evident it's a low budget movie, but that doesn't really hamper the movie too much, to be honest with you. It's very simplistic in that sense. Again, it's a very minimal plot, minimal dialogue in there, and honestly, it's kind of a slow movie. Like, for the reputation it has as being kind of an extreme movie or an exploitation movie, and it's not that that reputation isn't warranted, but it's kind of slow. There's time between the kills and things like that. And the gore in it is effective, but it's not really all that great, if I'm being honest with you. Like, the gore doesn't look totally realistic, but it's still effective. The violence is still powerful in the movie. And then like there is some other like scenes of violence, like there's like some graphic sexuality in this movie, and the violence is always rather shocking and rather visceral. And I think that's where the reputation comes from. It really feels like violence. You actually feel it, and that's kind of the vibe of this movie. Like I said, it's a little bit slow. It can get a little bit slow between kills and things like that. But when they happen, they are shocking, and they hit pretty good. And the vibe of that is what we're talking about here, because this movie is not really, like I said, narratively deep, and it feels very experimental. It almost feels like just kind of like languid, but it's about the violence, right? The shocking nature of the violence and the way it kind of intrudes this languid, almost tranquil, trance-like vibe of the movie is really what it winds up doing so well. And I think it's what gives it that reputation of being a little bit more extreme than it genuinely actually is. It's a vibe. It's a vibe of a movie. And it's interesting because the movie is based on a real American serial killer, real life killer named Carl Panzram. I'm not familiar with him, to be honest with you. And it's loosely based on him, to be honest with you. It's so it's not like it really matters all that much because, again, narratively, there's not much going on here. It's a pretty simplistic movie, but it's a good one. Again, if you like kind of artsy films, a little bit more art house looking film, this one might scratch that itch for you. It's one of the things I like about it. Like, it is an exploitation movie. It is kind of extreme. It's kind of an underground film, but it looks arty. It looks art housey, and I liked that. I like the kind of ethereal nature of it. It really drew me in and makes the movie more interesting than it might otherwise be. It might otherwise feel very simplistic or base, like something like August Underground. And that's not to critique August Underground, but August Underground pretty simplistic, right? This feels like it's got more merit, like it's trying to say something deeper. And I don't think it actually really is. It just kind of ambitiously looks better and more intriguing than it should. And I'll credit Jorg for that. I'll credit the directing, because here's the thing. I didn't really love Necromantic. When we talked about it, I think it's kind of overrated and it's gory and gross, and subject matter is disgusting and everything like that. But honestly, it's not a very well made or good movie. This movie is actually pretty well made. I'm actually surprised, especially after having seen Necromantic, that this movie is as good as it is. I'm kind of surprised by how much I liked it, to be honest with you. But it's one I think that is worth seeing if you can handle the subject matter. Again, it's not. It's got a reputation that maybe isn't 100% deserved, but it is deserved enough. There's enough in there to be disturbed by. So, proceed with caution if you want to check this out. But I would definitely say go ahead and give it a chance. Give it a chance. Give it a shot. But go in with your eyes open to knowing what you're about to get. So don't say I didn't warn you. The next German horror movie we're looking at today, the graduate level selection, is The Fan. And The Fan, which is also known as Der Fan in German, came out in 1982 and was directed by Eckhard Schmidt, who also apparently wrote the novel that this movie is based on. It has the same title, Der Fan, and I'm not really familiar with anything else he did, to be honest with you. This seems to be like the thing that's the most noteworthy thing he did, and I have not read the book, to be clear on that either, but we are going to dig into the movie in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a teenage girl who is obsessed with this pop singer known only as the letter R. And he's very popular, and she is head over heels obsessed with him to the detriment of her whole life. She is losing friends, losing boyfriends, failing school, losing the respect of her parents, and eventually losing a place to live as she winds up running away to chase her fantasy of being with R. And he actually does pay attention to her, and that's when the hijinks start to abound, because things don't go the way that anybody's expecting them to go. I'll tell you that. But we're going to go ahead and stop there and not spoil it for everybody. But this is another one that has a reputation for being a little bit more on the extreme side. And in this case, it might not be as warranted, but like Shrem, this one is a really interestingly well-made, artistic feeling movie. In fact, maybe even more so than Shrem, because it feels more professionally made. And it has, again, that kind of art house feel. In fact, I would say, and I think somebody else said this in reviews, that it's more art house than grindhouse, even though the reputation would have it be kind of a grindhouse movie. And I think part of that's because of the nature of the subject matter. Specifically, the lead actor, Desiree Nosebush, and I hope I'm pronouncing that name right again too, who was, I think, around 17 at the time they're filming this movie. And she's playing somebody, I think, supposedly younger. Somebody's probably supposed to be younger. And look, she's captivating in the movie. She's beautiful. She is just kind of, like, again, ethereal, graceful, but she's a cipher in this movie. She is an obtuse character. We don't really have a lot of insight into her inner thoughts. And all we have is this kind of like weird aloofness that makes her hard to relate to, but you're still drawn to her. You still find her likable, and you're still rooting for her. The movie doesn't really want to explore like her mental health, her mental state of mind, It doesn't really want to go into that. It kind of wants to leave you looking in from the outside on that, which I think is very effective, but it makes for a really interesting hour plus of the movie, which admittedly is kind of slow, right? It's really, again, kind of dreamlike, kind of ethereal. It's got some really cool imagery. It's a really well-made movie. I will call this one pretty. This one's a pretty movie, but it's also got like a lot of scenes of her going to the post office in Act 1, right? Waiting for a letter back from R because she keeps writing him love letters and he doesn't respond. And she's getting more and more frustrated. It's a little bit of a slow burn of like what you've got, like this girl who's got like this childlike crush, right? Until it's not, until things go a little bit too far. And that's where Act 3, where the horror aspect of this starts to kick in, is in Act 3. And it's interesting because there's a little bit of a sadness to this movie. You actually, again, empathize with this girl, or sympathize with her at least, that she's got this crush and she's too young to really understand anything else, and like how kind of insane and ridiculous her actions are. And things get a little carried away when she finally meets him, and he does take an interest in her, and things get uncomfortable. If I'm gonna be honest with you, that's when things start to feel exploitation-y. It gets uncomfortable. There's a lot of nudity in this movie. And again, she's 17 at most in this movie, maybe even a little younger. And I think she's supposed to be playing, I got the vibe that she was maybe like 14 or 15, right? And so much so that I had to look it up. I had to look up the like age of consent in Germany in 1982. And it's actually 14, although it's a little complicated because like, there's different circumstances that make it 16, and it doesn't matter. All that matters is it feels a little off, a little uncomfortable, and then things get horrific, right? I don't want to spoil the movie, obviously, but a lot of critics like to compare this movie to the movie Audition, and I see that. It's not the same thing as Audition. It's not. It goes a different way. Arguably goes more gruesome than Audition. I'll just put it out there. But it goes in a way I wasn't expecting, and it goes in a way that is pretty hardcore. It really is pretty hardcore. It's still done really artistically, though. Like, the gore in the movie is gory, but it's done like tastefully, for lack of a better way of putting it. It's got that kind of like, again, that dreamlike quality to it, that languid, ethereal quality to it that just makes it feel more artistic than the subject matter would have you believe. And I'm not going to spoil what that subject matter is, but suffice to say, it is unsettling, and it's interesting. It's a really captivating visual thing to watch, and not to mention the music slaps. Like, it's good. Like, if you like 1980s new wave like I do, you're gonna dig this music. The soundtrack is done by a band called Reinhold. I'm not familiar with them. You think about European new wave music in that time period. Yeah, it's good stuff, man. So a little bit repetitious, some of the songs, but it's good, and it all goes together really nicely. Now, when I look up the criticism of this movie and like the reviews, there's some talk about the allegories between this girl's fascination with this rock star and like the country's fascination with Adolf Hitler and like the National Socialism movement. And this allegory, to me, I'll be honest with you, it didn't hit for me. I didn't really pick up on that until I read about it. But the idea of like the fanaticism being like explored in this movie was apparently very controversial in Germany. And this movie had, a lot of controversy surrounding it, but it did get a cult following. Critics really seem to dig it, and it does have a bit of an underground reputation as being, again, a little bit of a hardcore movie, a little bit of a rough watch. For that ending, I think so. But people don't really talk about how artistic and beautiful this movie is. It is very pretty, some really great performances in it. Definitely one worth seeing. But again, like the sex stuff might be a little uncomfortable for some people. It wasn't comfortable for me, so consider that. But another one to go and check out if you can find it. In our last German horror movie selected today, the postgraduate level selection is Nosferatu the Vampire. Nosferatu the Vampire came out in 1979 and was directed by Werner Herzog, the legendary director and actor and documentarian and everything, super cool guy who somehow we've never actually talked about on the horror movie syllabus. He's not really necessarily known for horror specifically, but I am a little surprised that he hasn't come up before on the syllabus. But I also knew that I was destined to do this movie. This was not going to be one that didn't get on the syllabus at some point in time. So here we are. It's the time. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, the movie is a remake of the 1922 silent German film Nosferatu, but it's also an adaptation of the novel Dracula, which, of course, Nosferatu was famously ripping off. But it's actually kind of just using the Dracula names and stuff like that. But it is Nosferatu in terms of a remake. But it's one that focuses a little bit more on the pathos and loneliness of the vampire as a creature. So it's got a little bit of a different take or a little bit of a different angle to the traditional story. But it is still the traditional story that has the same traditional hijinks. Now I'll stop there so as to not spoil it too much more. But again, if you're familiar with the story of Dracula, you're familiar with the story. You know what to expect here. And it is doing a really good job of translating the story, modernizing it a little bit. It's still a period piece, but modern camera work and things like that, lighting, etc. But it's still being very true to the source material being the 1922 film. And it's doing a really great job of that by not just the direction, but also the casting. Now, famous German actor Klaus Kinski, who I think we have talked about on the channel before, is playing the lead role. He's playing Dracula, or Count Orlok, if you were looking at it from the Nosferatu angle. But he's playing this role really fantastically creepy, yet also somehow a little bit charming. So he's combining the Max Schreck Nosferatu version of it with the little bit more modern take of like the Bela Lugosi or even Gary Oldman Dracula version of that. It's a little bit more charming, a little bit more appealing, and kind of blending this together in a way that works really, really well. And the character design is very much an homage to Max Schreck. He looks more like Max Schreck. He looks more monstrous, and it works. It works really well. He looks great. He's playing it really well, a little bit understated. And Kinski's a great actor, and he's doing a great job here. And then, of course, his love interest is Isabella Adjani. And we've talked about her for sure, on Possession being the most noteworthy thing that most people know her from. I've known her from a lot of other things too. Wonderful actor, beautiful actor, just really stunning. And that's a big part of the appeal of her here, because I guess her dialogue is actually maybe dubbed. If the research I did is correct, her dialogue is dubbed. It's actually not her voice in this movie for some inexplicable reason. But the performance physically, visually, still very much works. She has those eyes, right? Those very expressive, legendary eyes that just draw you in, have a little bit of crazy behind them, a little bit of wild behind them. She's doing the same thing in Possession that she does here, in terms of just like this really captivating performance that just really kind of grabs hold of you. You can understand why people would be obsessed with her. It really works. The casting in this is excellent. But what we've got here is Herzog doing a really beautiful job. Once again, we've got a movie that is wonderfully shot. The composition of the shots, the locations that they're using, the imagery that they're doing. A lot of the imagery that they're doing is like iconic scenes from Nosferatu that they're doing a recreation of, like the shadow scene and stuff like that. They're doing a recreation of certain things in a more of a modern way, but it's still very aesthetically pleasing. It looks beautiful. They did a really cool job of finding a location. Like the castle they're filming in is really impressive. The area, the courtyard and the town, it all looks really rich and interesting and cool. It just has this aesthetic that really works for it. And it's interesting because the movie is slow and very meditative. It really never feels dull though. Even though these things are true, it does have a little bit of a slow pace. It doesn't get boring. It feels like poetry. It's a very poetic movie. The images are telling a story in and of itself. Like the shots are languid and long, but they're beautiful to look at. And I guess there's both an English and a German version of this movie. I watched the German version of it. I don't think I've ever seen the English dub version of it. And it's not even dubbed. They filmed it in both languages, and I haven't seen the English version. So I don't know if that changes it at all. But in German, it works really, really well. It really does. Just it seems beautiful. Like you're seeing a theme here in the movies. Talking about like the visual aspects of these movies are just really captivating and wonderful and just pretty to look at. And we're seeing it a lot. Even when it's something like Shram, which is a little bit more guttural and gross, it's still pretty. And in this movie, it's really gothic and wonderful. I really like the aesthetic of this movie a lot. I like this movie a lot. Again, I'm not easy sell for the Dracula story. It's one of my favorites, so it's easy one for me to get behind. But this one is one that is critically praised. People loved this movie when it came out. It was a really big box office hit. There's a movie, Nosferatu in Venice, which is sequel in name only, has nothing to do with the original. I've never even seen it, to be honest with you. But the original one, the original remake, Nosferatu the Vampire, is outstanding. It's Herzog at one of his best, in my opinion. So this is one that I would say is a must-see for horror fans. If you haven't seen it before, definitely check it out because it is a beautiful movie. It is a nice retelling of the Dracula story through the lens of the Nosferatu ripoff, and it comes together wonderfully. It's just a really great film, so check it out if you haven't seen it before. So those are our selections for German horror movies, but of course I've got a few extra credit movies I want to talk to you about. There's some really great German stuff out here, guys, so let's go ahead and dig into a few extra credit movies as well. The first one I want to talk about is called Antibodies. Antibodies came out in 2005 and was directed by Christian Albert. And Christian Albert is known for Case 39 and Pandorum. These are movies you may have seen. They're, they have a little bit of reputation. They're movies that probably aren't going to make the syllabus, if I'm being honest with you, but they're not bad, and so he's got some legit cred under his belt. And it's worth noting because it's like, mainstream type movies, and this is kind of a mainstream movie in appearance, but we're going to get into that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a serial killer who's been caught by the police, and he's confessed to the murder and sexual assault of like 13 young boys. But this cop in a small village who's investigating the death of a young girl is wanting to know if this guy killed the young girl, and everybody thinks he did, but the cop thinks there's something more to it. And of course, there's a cat and mouse as he interviews and interrogates this suspect and tries to figure out what happened to this young girl, as of course the hijinks start to abound. I'm going to go ahead and stop there so as not spoil the movie for you. But right off the bat, what you're going to get a sense of is how this movie is influenced by Silence of the Lambs and the idea of, a serial killer being talked to by law enforcement to try to get help to solve another case. And it even calls this out. early in the movie, the serial killer refers to himself and says, were you expecting Hannibal Lecter? And name checks it right off the bat, which maybe not the greatest of idea. Don't remind me of a movie that's actually a masterpiece and then not be a masterpiece yourself. But this movie gets away with it because it does something a little bit different. It does, though, reference overtly Silence of the Lambs. Look, the guy's no Hannibal Lecter. He's no Anthony Hopkins. Let me just put it out there, right? And it also like is kind of influenced by Red Dragon. The character is less Hannibal Lecter and more Francis Dollarhide, to be honest with you, and more crass version of it. But with the painting and stuff like that, he really comes off more like a Francis Dollarhide type character. But he is ultimately kind of like your stereotypical Hollywood serial killer, right? And he has a serial killer lair at the beginning of the movie, and it all feels very like a Hollywood production. It's not a Hollywood production, it's a German production, but it's a very slick movie. It looks really good. Norman Reedus is in the movie at the beginning in a little bit kind of a cameo role. So it feels like a more mainstream Hollywood type movie, just with a lot more full frontal male nudity than you would expect to see in a Hollywood film, frankly. But it's definitely a newer, slicker, more modern look of a movie, and it's got that kind of police procedural thriller feel to it. And I'm saying all this to make it like as if it's a bad thing. It's not. It's a very good thing. The movie is admittedly a bit of a slow burn, but it is kind of leaning into this cop procedural thing. And it's got these stereotypes of the serial killer and everything like that, and his lair and all that. And it's got the Silence of the Lambs vibe to it. But what it's really doing is something much more interesting. You know, it lulls you into this idea that you're kind of maybe watching like a German take on a buddy cop film, and you kind of are to some degree, you know, except that everybody's kind of humorless. Nobody's cracking jokes that much, really. And it's like these strong personalities, these tough guy cops, and they're all trying to crack this serial killer, but he only talked to the one cop. He's kind of messing with them. But that's where the movie is interesting. And it takes a while for you to figure this out. For a long time, the movie will feel like a rote procedural. But what they're really doing is looking at this psychological game that the serial killer is playing and describing his disturbing, kind of disgusting crimes and the dark stuff they're talking about. What they're really kind of getting towards are some really heady ideas about the root of evil and like why do people do things that are evil? Why do good people do things that are good? What makes them good? What makes them evil? And how does the soul get corrupted? And that's really what the movie's kind of going towards, this mind game thing. It's a long movie. It's a little over 2 hours long. So that's why the first part maybe feels a little bit slow, because when they're really trying to get to this kind of psychological and kind of intellectual exercise in evil and the meanings of it is where the meat and potatoes is of this movie. And it feels more earned when you have the setup before. And it also feels like it's taken a surprise, not twist really, but a surprise thing that makes this movie feel much less rote than you're expecting it to be. You know, it's got this whole thing with this small town cop, and he's investigating this horrible murder of this young girl. And the entire community has been shaken by this. It's a small village, and the impact it's had on them is really kind of tearing them apart. So he's desperate to find this out, and everybody just wants to kind of pin it on this one serial killer, but he doesn't think that's right, and he thinks there might be something else going on there. But where it leads him is incredibly dark and maybe slightly predictable, but also not predictable. But what you're starting to see is his mental breakdown, his moral breakdown, this chipping away at his soul, and the peril of his family, specifically his son, but also his wife, and the degradation of his relationships. All of this is just like going on in terms of this mystery and this police procedural and this investigation of this serial killer and this mind game. There's admittedly maybe too much going on in this one movie, but it's all good stuff. And it all does manage to kind of come together at the end in a way that I found to be very satisfying. So this is one I actually liked quite a bit, even though it took me a little while to come on board with it. For the first, 45 minutes or so, I was kind of, this feels a little bit rote. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly interesting, but it got really interesting. I really liked the existential and kind of theological ways it's starting to look at into crime and horror and murder and things like that. Really could have gone farther even. But I like that it stops where it does and lets the audience kind of catch up and figure out what message it wants to take away from it, because it does have a message, and it's really interesting. I don't want to spoil too much, but I really like where this movie wound up, and I think it's a good one to check out. It's not too rough to watch, so I would recommend it to anybody. Check this one out if you haven't seen it. Antibodies is worth checking out for sure. And the next extra credit movie I want to talk about is The Burning Moon. The Burning Moon came out in 1992 and was directed by Olaf Edenbach, and I think I've got that one right actually, And Olaf is known for a lot of like B-grade horror movies, none of which I really was that familiar with or recognized. But really has his reputation for is his special effects work, his practical gore effects in particular. That's what he's apparently known for, and he's showing that off to great effect here in The Burning Moon. But we're going to get into that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie's about this ne'er-do-well junkie drug addict whose parents force him to babysit his little sister. And so when he's babysitting her, he thinks it's a perfect opportunity to tell her a couple of bedtime stories that are just really messed up and really violent and dark and inappropriate for a child, frankly. And he sees nothing wrong with this at all. But of course it bothers her, and we see the visual representations of these and all the hijinks that abound with them. So that's the movie, and I'll stop there and not spoil it for anybody, but it is kind of an anthology style story in the sense that it's showing different stories that are being told to this little girl, but they're being told in a way that is kind of well, no other way to put it, cheap, right? This movie is low budget. It's very low quality video, and yeah, it's made in the 90s, early 90s, and it looks like it. It's not very well made in terms of like the quality of the film, but it does actually hold its own, even though like the acting is amateurish. Like the director is the lead in the movie, he's playing the main guy, and it looks like an SOV, it feels like an SOV, and yet where it gets its reputation, and it's a pretty well-deserved reputation, is in the gore, is in the violence of this, because the plot is paper thin. It really is like a simple like wraparound story excuse for an anthology story of creepy things happening, and it's only 2 stories and he tells too, not even like 3, which you would normally expect in like an American production. But it is a memorable movie because of the gore that goes in there. The terrible protagonist is very obvious. The gore is the standout. It's really what you're here for, and it's fun. It's very imaginative. The practical effects are very well done. Olaf knows what he's doing. And it's interesting because he does some stunts in the movie too. Like he jumps through a window, he sets himself on fire in this movie. So he's really kind of just doing it all there. And honestly, the low image quality of the video, the SOV, is kind of beneficial to the gore because it hides the seams a little bit more. So the gore feels like it looks a little bit more realistic. It feels a little bit more gritty because it's kind of like cheap looking video. And the gore is what you're here for. It's what the movie's reputation is, and it's what you're here for. And it's got this wild ending, crazy gore ending. The eyeball scene is the standout in this. It is what the movie is probably most notorious for, is that particular scene. And it does cap off a really wildly gory, horrific orgy of violence at the end of the movie, and that is one of the most memorable parts of it. But there is a lot of great gag effects here. They're really good. Now, the pacing is a little off in this movie. It can take a little while between those kills, so that's a little bit of an issue. You feel the pacing a little bit. It's not a long movie, but it feels a little longer than it actually is. Now, it is weird because the pacing's off a little bit. The editing is fairly decent. Like, it's a competently made movie. It's a low budget made movie, and it's not a very good made movie, but it's a competent movie. Like the music works for it. The sound again is pretty good. I can hear everybody talking compared to other shot on videos where these technical aspects are lacking. This one's got it down pretty good. And it's for a low budget movie, it's competently made, but it's the effects. That's where the effects are. And that's what's got Germany banning it for like a couple of decades, apparently. It's only recently been available, apparently, because between the gore and the sexual assault in the movie, it has a reputation for being this splatter film that's pretty violent and gross. A rather exceptional splatter film. It's a well-deserved reputation as being a really good example of splatter, and I agree with that. The gore, the splatter, the blood in this movie is top-notch. It's a lot of fun. Like I said, it's not perfectly realistic, but it doesn't need to be. It's still effective. It still works. And that's the reason to see this movie. If you're a gore hound, this one is one to check out. If you're not, this is probably one you could skip. Like I said, that's really all it's got going for it. The narrative is whatever. The acting is not particularly good. It's for the gore effects. That's what you're coming here to see. And if you're not into that, don't even bother. But if you like gore effects, check out Burning Moon. And the last extra credit movie I want to talk about is Lose. Lose came out in 2018 and is directed by Tillman Singer, who, then this is his debut movie, but you might know him as the director of the movie Cuckoo that came out a couple of years ago that we did talk about here on the channel and is great. And this is his debut, and it was actually his film school thesis project. And it's really interesting what he did here, and it has a lot of the same kind of strange and ethereal vibes that Cuckoo had. So if you're familiar with Cuckoo, you might be familiar with this one, but if you're not, we're going to dig into it in just a minute. First, if you haven't seen it before, the premise of the movie is that this young taxi driver has witnessed some sort of accident or something and is being questioned by the police, and they're bringing in a psychologist, a doctor of some sort, to try to hypnotize her so they can get more information about what she has been witness to. And there's an aspect of this where maybe there is a possession angle going on here. Maybe something in this taxi driver's past has made her more susceptible to it, and maybe there's going to be a problem in this police precinct. But I'm going to stop there and not spoil it for you. But the reason why I'm being a little weird and vague about the plot of this movie is because it's a weird, vague plot, frankly. It's a little bit more ethereal again, and kind of obtuse intentionally, and it works out really, really well. But it is also making for a kind of a hard narrative to follow in a good way. Again, like I said, if you thought Cuckoo was weird but captivating, I think you're going to be down for this one too. It's supposedly, like, again, it's his film school project, and it's supposedly an homage to like 80s European horror movies. And I do get that sense. I get that vibe from it. But it's so confidently directed. For a first-time debut, it's a really well-directed movie. And that's the aspect of this movie that is most impressive, because it's immediately compelling right from the very start. It's got this hypnotic, dreamlike vibe to it. I know we've been saying that a lot about these movies, but it's true. And this one is probably the best of the bunch in terms of how it looks. The aesthetic is so good in this movie. It starts with these long stationary cameras, like the camera's set up in one place and the action's just kind of happening there. And they do this a few times, these long shots, and they're kind of removed away from it, giving you this vibe of being like kind of on the outside looking in. It sets like this kind of eerie tone for it that is distinctly different, honestly, from the typical German vibe in terms of like the exploitation and underground horror stuff. This is feeling much more like a blend of mainstream and art house that is just working really well. The sound design in this movie is fantastic. It really works like gangbusters to draw you in and to kind of deliver some of the tension and the scares that you're expecting in this movie, which is a supernatural horror movie. And it's a possession story. I'll be honest with you, it's a possession story, but it's a very unique one. It's not like one I'd seen before previously. It's a different take on possession that worked for me very well. I like possession movies. You know, a lot of them are very just kind of exorcist-y kind of stuff. This isn't. This is different than that, and I like that. I like the fresh angle, the fresh take on that. It feels fresh and weird, and again, in a good way. It's a very strange movie. The timeline of this movie is very wonky, and it's deliberately obtuse. Like I said, it's trying to kind of be a little confusing and hard to follow and narratively challenging, and as a result, it can be a little hard to get into, but the style more than makes up for it. It's just visually captivating, like arresting. I was really drawn into the style of this movie, the way it looked. And I do feel like that ultimately the narrative pays off. Like, it's great that it's so lit well and shot well, and the camera angles are great, the sound is wonderful, and all of that stuff is working gangbusters. But the narrative is hard to follow, but I do feel like it paid me off for investing my time into it. I really love this movie. I really loved Cuckoo, so I was kind of predisposed to like this one. If you didn't like Cuckoo, I don't think you're going to like this one, because I think this was even harder to understand than Cuckoo. But it really drew me in, man. Again, it felt very different from other German productions, in part because the main woman is Spanish, right? So it is interesting to see that kind of take in it. But good performances, great direction, just a really captivating film that I was very interested in. And I really wanted to put it on this list because I felt like it, even though like ostensibly we've been talking a lot about these dreamlike ethereal type movies, this one feels very different aesthetically from everything else we talked on this list and from all the other German stuff I've seen before. I'm very excited to see what Tillman Singer does next, because I really have liked his other movies. And I think that this is a guy to watch and to keep our eye on, because I think he's going to keep doing awesome stuff. But if you haven't seen Lose, check this one out. It's the 2018 version, because there's a couple of different movies with his name. This one's a 2018 one, but check it out and give it your time, because it definitely deserves it. So that's going to do it for our exploration into German horror. Like I said, it's something I just kind of wanted to set up for myself as a challenge to get a little bit more fluent in German horror movies. And I'm glad I did, because it's some great stuff. I left some stuff on the table too. There's other stuff that I haven't checked out that I could have put in this video, and probably will at some point in a doctor's selection or whatever, but definitely stuff to dig into. So if you like German horror, there's other things to explore, but start here. Start with the movies I'm talking about, the ones that maybe appeal to you. It's a good place to start. And now it's a place to start for horror trivia is to look at this card that I'm holding and try to answer the question live on camera. Because we're talking about German horror, we're obviously going to go with the international category on the card. And here's our question. What is the profession of the crew that television reporter Angela Vidal is following at the start of 2007's Wreck? I do know the answer to this question. I love Wreck. Wreck is great. It's one of the best found mockumentary found footage, probably more found footage, horror movies out there. Wonderful film. We have talked about it on the channel. I think a lot of people are dialed in on Wreck, and yeah, there's a whole franchise and it's diminishing returns. But man, that first one is fantastic, and I think a lot of people probably remember the answer to this question because it's kind of central to the setup of the movie. You know, if you haven't seen Wreck, it's like everything is taking place in one location and the outbreak that's happening is all in one location. And that location is indicative of the answer to this question. So that's my little hint to you. But I think if you've seen this movie, you know the answer to this question. And if you haven't seen this movie, you're just taking a shot in the dark. And I don't know. First of all, why haven't you seen Wreck? You should see Wreck. I know Snake foreign films and subtitles isn't for everybody, but man, Wreck is one that's worth just making the effort for because it is so well done, so good, just like top tier version of that kind of movie. So high recommend about Wreck. But I've prattled on enough, giving you some chance to think about it. If you don't already know the answer, take a guess, lock in your answer because it's that time. I've already locked in my answer, so are we good? Okay, so the answer is they're firefighters. They are talking to a group of firefighters at the firehouse, and the card says firefighters, yeah. So that's the thing, right? They're all locked up in this firehouse, firehouse, and they're trapped in there. And that's a big part of the story. So yeah, I think that one's fairly easy if you've seen the movie, but if not, you probably struggle with that one. But let me know if you've seen Wreck. Let me know if you've seen any of these horror movies from Germany that we talked about here. And also let me know if there's any other German horror movies that you think are great. I might have seen them before, might have talked about them on the channel already, might want to be adding them to my 2 watch list and checking them out in another video. But until then, I'm just going to say, class dismissed.